A lot has been said in the past few days and weeks about Nvidia specifically, but also the entire position of the tech space when you are talking about graphics cards and gaming specifically. And I thought I would share some of my thoughts on one thing in particular that I have been very interested in and something that has come up a lot recently, and that is, of course, gaming laptops. Now, gaming laptops are sort of in a transitional period right now where we we've had this time in laptops where there has been very few options for laptop GPUs. And more than anything, laptops have had this transition where they've gone from being sort of a big variety of gaming laptops when you're talking about the 10 series of cards, specifically the 1050 and 1060 laptop, to the RTX revolution where laptops then sort of moved on to being 20 series and 30 series laptops. And for the most part, these laptops were very underwhelming or very expensive when you're getting to the more performant options. And getting something that was a good value and right in the middle has been extremely difficult when you're talking about laptops in the last decade or so. After the whole 10 series of laptops, there's also been a big influx of business laptops. And while these have had some increase in gaming capability thanks to, advancements in the APU segment of the entire tech space, it hasn't really been something that is usable for people that are taking a multifaceted approach to, buying a laptop. People that have more needs than just Microsoft, the Microsoft Suite, Excel, Word, that kind of thing. But also people that want to play games and people that might want to do things like video editing or, other facets of design or production. And so laptops have had a period now where more interesting options have become available. And these options are things like not so much, in terms of AMD, but in terms of NVIDIA, they have been releasing interesting laptops. And for the most part, the sentiment around this has been quite negative due to, increased pricing. And that is 100% correct because these laptops are extremely expensive for what you are getting for your money. And I'm not going to argue that. But I do feel that especially with the release of the 5050 laptop specifically, which, I'm talking about the 8 gigabyte variant, in the first time in years, there is actually an interesting option for prospective laptop buyers that want, something that can do a lot but can also game. Now, depending on what CPU you get and what sort of power delivery you get for whatever laptop SKU you might be interested in, it's going to have a big effect on the performance of the laptop. But I thought I would take this video today to look at the difference that the new 5050 laptop SKU has as compared to something from the previous generation, something like a 4060 laptop, which at this point is still going to be close in price when you look at new pricing. And I think it's going to be interesting. Now, the 5050 does use GDDR7 memory, and so the memory is more efficient, it runs cooler, it is faster, and all around it is just a better product. It also, of course, has access to the newest RTX features that come along with the 50 series of RTX cards, which the 4060 laptop won't have, although it is still a relatively new product and will have a lot of these features. The 5050 is going to have more. And, I'm not going to look at that specifically for the comparison, but that is something to keep in mind when you are looking at buying new hardware. Now, if you've watched my videos in the past, I'm not the biggest fan of RTX. I think a lot of it is gimmicky, and I'm not going to get into that too much right now. But even with that said, there is a certain amount of value that it does provide. And while I'm not going to take that into consideration when comparing. That is something to consider. So for this one, let's take a look at how these two laptops perform against each other, and let's see if there has been a big leap from 40 series to 50 series, and if it is ultimately worth your money. Let's do it. So thank you to the creator of this channel for providing us with the benchmarks, so that we can compare. It's a very valuable service that these people provide. Let's see if we can find out who the channel is. It is a channel called Game Tests. So thank you to them. Check them out, and let's get into it. Now, first up here, we are looking at Forza Horizon 5, and these tests are going to be 1080p because that is realistically the resolution that you want to be looking at when you test something of this value. Now, I'm not getting into pricing or anything like that, but this is going to be a laptop that will be around $1,000 for both the 4060 and the 5050. The 4060 is going to beat the 5050 in some tests, and I think the 5050 will beat the 4060 in others. I believe the 5050 does draw more power, but because of that GDDR7 memory, it is going to have better power delivery, power consumption, power use. So there is a bit of a trade-off there, but in terms of this, these laptops are fairly similar. The 4061 has an i9, which is of course a little bit better, but it is a 13th gen i9, and the 5050 has a i7 14th gen. So perhaps there's a bit of an advantage in terms of CPU power, so it's perhaps not a true benchmark, but that gives even more testament to the performance of the 5050, regardless of price, because I can't get into that because it's going to be dependent on your situation. But regardless of that, let's look at the performance. So getting into it on Forza, the 4060 is leading with about 8 FPS average, but both are delivering a very good playable performance at above 80 FPS, both running at HD maximum. So that's very impressive. Cyberpunk, I believe, is going to be a similar sort of situation. We are looking at 1080p ray tracing ultra, but DLSS quality. Now that's not exactly how I would play this on a laptop, but still, in that situation, we are looking at 74 FPS average on the 4060 and 63 on the 5050. So the 4060 has the 5050 beat so far, but it is relatively close. And then moving on to The Witcher 3, it's a similar situation with the 5050 42 average and the 4060 44 average. So very close here, but the 4060 is still beating it a little bit. And both of these are running relatively cool for laptops. Now, of course, there are certain factors that we can't take into account, like which laptop is which, because that's going to impact performance, power delivery, and like I said, the CPUs aren't necessarily exactly the same. So perhaps it would be fair if we subtracted a few points from the 4060 laptop, just because it has a more powerful CPU, but at the end of the day, it's going to be very close. And I think realistically, these two GPUs perform very similarly. In Hogwarts here, it is 77 average for the 4060. We are running at ultra settings 1080p native, and we are looking at 73 average for the 5050. So both very good playable performances, but still the 4060 has the 5050 beat. Red Dead Redemption 2 ultra 1080p. For the first time, the 5050 has taken the lead. Now again, for the third time, the CPU is going to have a big impact on this. Because in many of these games that does drive a lot of extra performance, and especially drives how smooth a game will feel. And you can see that both of these are doing fairly well. The 4060 laptop is pulling a bit more power, and so I think there is a bit of an advantage for it, but at the end of the day, these two tests are very close. 1080p high for highest for I think that's what it was. Highest settings for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, a game getting on a bit now, but both of these doing quite well. And again, the 5050 beats it, but it is very close. Moving on to Starfield here, 1080p ultra settings. We are getting to a space with laptops now where these games are playable at Ultra on laptops, and these are games that 2 or 3 years ago were difficult with desktop high-end GPUs to get these sort of results. So we are looking at 64 average on the 4060 and 60 average on the 5050. Black Myth, 1080p high settings. We are looking at another victory for the 4060, but another close one. So it is 74 as opposed to 68, but both of these are fantastic results, and nothing in this series of tests has been under 60 FPS. So ultimately, I think these two laptops are very close. One has a slightly older but much better CPU. Both have the same amount of RAM, and both are just good laptops. Now, power delivery is something else. The 4060 laptop seems to be pulling more power than the 5050, and so that is a restriction. And I do think that if you equaled that out and allowed the 5050 laptop to pull the exact same amount of power, the 5050 laptop would probably be beating the 4060 just a little bit. But at the end of the day, these two cards, when you're talking about laptops, are very close in performance, and it's an interesting result. Now, should you get these? For the first time in years, I would probably say yes to either of these, but at the end of the day, I would go for the 5050 because of the access to the newest features, the better memory, and the better power usage, all in all. Depending on the shroud of laptop that you get, you could get some better performance than this. But it's an interesting place now with laptops where, the pricing still isn't good. I don't think that's ever going to be good. But at least the performance is getting to a point where, even if it is just at 1080p, you can start maxing out these AAA games and having some pretty good playable experiences. So I would say, if you can find one on a good special, maybe some tech special or something, Black Friday coming up, something like that, probably go for it if you can get it for a fair price. But for $1,000, the sort of desktop PC you can build is going to beat this. If you absolutely have to have a laptop, that's a different conversation. But for $1,000, you could get a desktop PC that will do this at 2K or in some cases even 4K. And so in that capacity, it doesn't make the most sense in the world. But just from a pure perspective of power and performance, I think these laptops have come a far way. And I know there's going to be a lot of negative sentiment about the 5050 laptop, and fairly so in some scenarios, but I do also think that there are some good things that it brings to the table. And if you're just looking at it from a raw numbers perspective, you can now play games at Ultra on these laptops, and you can have a good time doing it. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Cheers.